Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mike Norvell, this Florida State program, and the 2024 season has, for lack of better terms, been an absolute disaster. And I feel like a lot of the national media conversation around this Florida State program goes to the quarterback spot. And look, I ain't getting up here and defending DJU. I was very vocal last week that I think Brock Glenn should get a chance to run this Florida State offense. I mean, 56% completion percentage, one touchdown to two interceptions. You can't win with that kind of quarterback play. But I feel like that conversation, I think a lot of Florida State fans who, follow the recruiting trail, follow the intricacies of this Florida State program know that that's not necessarily the biggest problem that we're seeing within this Florida State program. Want to talk about some significant changes that need to be made within this Florida State team. I have the roster up because it kind of paints a picture in terms of how Florida State has gone about building this roster. And we can kind of get into it right now. It's been really reliant on the transfer portal. And yeah, during the offseason, we were kind of all letting it slide a little bit, kind of knowing that, hey, Florida State's got to do a little bit better recruiting the high school ranks and developing that high school talent. But we were all kind of just letting it slide because Mike Norvell won 13 games last year. And you obviously hit on some transfer portal additions, guys like Jared Verse and Braden Fisk. But I think in the back of every Florida State fan's mind was, is this a sustainable way to build a program that wants to compete at the highest level of college football every single year? I think we all knew the answer was no, but since it was working on the football field, not really many people, including myself, got up there and talked about it. There needs to be significant changes to this Florida State program, not only from a coaching staff perspective, but also from a player personnel and roster management perspective. Want to get into some of those changes, where I think those changes can kind of come from. Now, before we get into it, as always, the Florida State fans, look, I know a lot of the conversation is around the quarterback spot. I would love to hear your opinions on that, but I think more importantly, would like to hear your opinions on kind of how this Florida State team is kind of run and where you think it's going. And I think most importantly, what changes would you like to see be made? I think we're going to see changes at the end of the season. I think we're going to see a lot of changes. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. A lot of you guys know this is one of the programs that I love talking about the most. You guys have shown a ton of support, whether we're talking about going 13-0, whether we're talking about this kind of conversation. Appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with a little bit of an optimistic note. And I'm not trying to be a sunshine pumper by any means. You've seen programs and head coaches go through this kind of rudder season, right? I think as a Michigan fan myself, we went through this 4 or 5 years ago with Jim Harbaugh. Some really good seasons, but never could really get past Ohio State. And then in 2020, during that COVID year, we went 2-4. Looked like a lifeless program that was more talented than a lot of teams we were playing, but you could tell the player development, what was going on the recruiting trail, it just wasn't good enough. Michigan largely just kind of cratered. Now, what happened with Michigan is it kind of forced Jim Harbaugh to make some significant changes in terms of how the program is run. I think Mike Norvell kind of knew, hey, we would like to recruit the high school ranks better, but because he was having so much success in the transfer portal, he said, hey, why don't we just kind of keep doing what we're doing? Because it's obviously working. But I think at the end of the day, Mike Norvell does not want this Florida State program to be a revolving door where you lose 30 guys, you gain 30 guys every single offseason. Yeah, I'm saying use the transfer portal. Just don't be relying on it in terms of building your roster. I think that is first the change that would made. We're going to talk a little bit about that later, but I think it starts with the coaching staff. Look at this Florida State roster, and you can look at the offensive side of the football. You can look at the defensive side of the football. The high school player development has been absolutely abysmal for this Florida State team. And I think, quite frankly, it starts with Alex Atkins on the offensive line. One, you've recruited two blue chip offensive line recruits out of high school in the last 4 years. That's not Power 5 level. And you're seeing it kind of play out in terms of how this offensive line looks. But I think the most concerning part is not only is the recruiting bad at the high school ranks, the player development has been a bit. I think this offensive line unit has gotten significantly worse than what it was in 2023. We always knew it was kind of the weakness of Florida State's team in 2023, but it wasn't a liability. This year, it's been a disaster. 2.2 yards per carry. That's 124th in the country. The pressure rate on DJU has been absolutely abysmal. And I get DJU's holding on to the football, has a long throwing motion. I get all that. But hey, we have two eyes. And we can see Florida State's offensive line largely getting their tail whipped along the line of scrimmage. You got multiple fourth and fifth year offensive linemen, and they just don't seem to have gotten better over the last couple of years. So I think that's where it starts. You got to recruit the high school ranks better, and you got to develop that talent. I would think a coaching change needs to be made there, not only from a recruiting perspective, but also a player development perspective. I think, secondly, you look at the linebacker coach, Randy Shannon. We talked about it all offseason. Like, Florida State has routinely missed on top linebacker recruits, often which would be right in their backyard. A guy like Raylan Wilson coming out in 2023, he looks like he's going to be a future All-American linebacker for Georgia. It should largely be a layup for Florida State, and we're missing out on those kind of guys. Obviously, the development at the linebacker spot hasn't been very good either. There's a lot of aspects about this Florida State team from a position coach standpoint that I think need change, right? The player development, again, from the high school guys. You look at the guys that have been Florida State's dudes over the last couple of years, right? Jared Verse, Braden Fisk. Those guys weren't recruited at the high school ranks. They weren't developed by the coaching staff that's presently on this Florida State roster. It's nice for Florida State to kind of come out with those graphics, 10, 11 NFL draft picks in the 2024 NFL draft. A lot of those names were guys that played at a high level and developed at a high level, not in Tallahassee, Florida. And I think, again, that's not a sustainable model. If you want to go to the transfer portal, quite frankly, there's a reason a lot of these guys are in the transfer portal, right? Malik Benson, Jalen Brown. The reason they were in the transfer portal is they weren't playing at the previous schools. Now, a guy like Malik Benson, I'm completely okay with Florida State taking a shot at, because we all thought he was really talented. He is really talented. Just hasn't really performed, hasn't really put it on the football field. I think, secondly, in kind of continuing our conversation, the player personnel evals and the management has been really bad. And again, I think you hit on some transfer portal additions over the last couple of years that kind of masked it. But you look at the high school recruiting. I mean, how many guys are we recruiting out of high school and then get developed into really good football players on this Florida State roster? We're looking at the offensive side of the football. I mean, Ja'Kai Douglas is a fifth-year senior who's just kind of a role player. Hakeem Williams, certainly not developed the way you want. You look at the offensive line, certainly no guys there. Lawrence Tuafili is probably the guy that you'd point to on the only guy that you'd point to on the offensive side of football. Maybe Darius Washington when he's healthy. The evaluations at the high school level in terms of talent they're bringing to Tallahassee hasn't been good. And I think, secondly, the transfer portal evaluations have been really, really bad as well. Outside of a couple hits, I mean, there's a lot of guys that are just kind of straight up misses. And I think Florida State moving forward needs to, they got to make changes. I think it starts with the coaching staff. Look, Mike Norvell is going to be the head coach in 2025. I think all Florida State fans know that. And quite frankly, I look at Mike Norvell and say, I believe in Mike Norvell. I think he's a guy that just went 13-0 last year. We know he can do it, but he's got to do it in a more sustainable model. And I think this kind of season is going to be a wake-up call for Mike Norvell in terms of how he wants to run this program. It starts with recruiting the high school ranks, developing those guys within the program. Now, you can use the transfer portal, but you look at this offensive side of the football, it's over half of the contributors on Florida State's offense, and it's the same thing on defense, are coming through the transfer portal. Use the transfer portal to supplement your roster, not build your roster. And Florida State over the last couple of years got lucky in building the roster through the transfer portal. It's not a sustainable way of running a college football program. And I think a lot of people might say, well, that's wrong. Look at Ole Miss. Ole Miss is going to have a season, I think, like Florida State had last year, where they hit on some guys. They got some guys in for a couple of different years. I don't think they're going to be very good next year. I think Lane Kiffin might take the job at Florida after this season because he probably knows it too. I think finally the conversation is, where does this Florida State team go from here? I think this season is largely a wash, right? You're 0-3. You look like you're probably not going to make a bowl game. And that's not me hating on Florida State. You all know I want to see Florida State win football games. You got to lean into the young talent. I don't think, and I think Bud Elliott on the Nolecast made a really good point. And we kind of talked about this late last week. Florida State fans care about winning ACC championships and making runs in the college football playoffs. They don't care about a 6-6 bowl game. And so if you're going to start DJU because you want to go 6-6 and make a bowl game, that doesn't make any sense. Like, if you're Florida State, you're kind of already looking at 2025 and how can we fundamentally change this program so we're back where we belong to start the 2025 year. That's the question Mike Norvell needs to answer. And how do you answer that question? It doesn't mean starting DJU, who's not going to be on this roster in 2025. It means throwing out Brock Glenn, even if he's not quite ready, and seeing what he can do. And I think answering the question, hey, is Brock Glenn a guy that we can win with in the 2025 season? If the answer is no, you might have to go to the transfer portal and hopefully get a better quarterback than you did with DJU. But I think that goes for every single position on this Florida State roster. You got to start leaning into the young talent. If it means you go 4-8 instead of 6-6, I think a lot of Florida State fans are okay with that. I'd rather watch a Florida State team that is going through some growing pains with some young talent than watching the veterans. One, lack of effort's been insane, but more importantly, just not play that good of football. That's kind of what I'm looking at here for Florida State. Again, I would love to hear how you guys are feeling in the comments section. Obviously, just a frustrating last couple of weeks. And again, I think it's a wake-up call for Mike Norvell. I think he tried to continue what he was doing because it was working. I think he secretly knew too this wasn't a sustainable model. You're going to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to run this Florida State program the right way. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.